I'm Maria Wilson.
And I'm Danielle Mandikian.
And we are scientists. We love science.
Yeah, we do. So when we aren't doing it, the next best thing is to talk about science. And what's really awesome is that we're surrounded by some of the most brilliant minds in research.
We're going to step away from the labs today to talk to other scientists about the cool stuff they are thinking about, working on, and imagining.
As well as how some of these discoveries just might lead to new medicines. So grab your favorite drink, get ready to unlock your science brain, and join us for Two Scientists Walk Into a Bar.
The show for scientists, science geeks, and the people who love them. So I wanted to ask you guys, what do you think has the most impact on the health of your lungs? The environment and what you breathe, or your genetics?
The most impact, I would say, what we breathe.
The air we breathe, but also too, genetics plays an important role in like the makeup of the body and how it reacts.
I would say environment. I think environment is the biggest one because you don't always realize the things that you're breathing in or that you're exposed to.
I think the environment more than genetics, if I had to choose, yeah.
Definitely a little of both.
I'd say a little of both, because I also have asthma.
The genetics can have an impact on, I don't know, your lungs' resistance to your environmental factors, but I still feel that if you're starting from like a blank slate, probably the air that you're breathing, I don't know, if it's unhealthy air, over time that's going to wear down your lungs, potentially.
Hi everyone, welcome to the show. I'm Maria Wilson, and today we're talking about one of the largest organs in our body, the lungs. The last time we covered this topic was in Season 4's episode, Take a Deep Breath, Treating Asthma. But of course there's a lot more to explore with the lungs, different diseases, different biologies to think about. So I'm excited to take another deep breath, no pun intended, and dive back in with two experts who have dedicated their careers to helping us all breathe a little easier. First, we have Dorothy Cheung, a clinician in the allergy and respiratory field and a researcher who works on the clinical development of drugs for lung diseases. Welcome to the show, Dorothy.
Thank you, Maria. So glad to be here.
And for the very first time in Two Scientists history, we are phoning in all the way from Basel, Switzerland. Joining us is Daniel Lafkas, a research scientist in Translational Discovery Research who concentrates on the biology of the lung and how to apply that to treating lung diseases. Welcome to the show, Daniel.
Thank you, Maria. Lovely to be here from the other side of the Atlantic.
Wonderful. So, Daniel, since you are in a different time zone and we're maybe keeping you from dinner, I wanted to start with you and ask you to describe the lung as an organ, how it develops, and what is its role in our overall health.
The lung is an interesting organ, one of the organs that develops actually partly during embryonic development, but also after we're born. The lung, especially in the first days after we're born, the first breath, everyone will be familiar with the first breath of a baby being born and the familiar cry. And that initiates the final steps of differentiation of the lung, which actually allows it to properly function and oxygenate our blood, giving all the energy that is needed for the rest of our organs to function.
That's actually fascinating to think that, yes, the lung has been developing there in utero for 9 months and doesn't get used until that first breath is taken when the baby is born. It's actually quite profound. Very cool. So Wellington was asking me earlier, what is the origin of the word lung? It's kind of a strange word. There's not many nouns in the English language that end in ung.
Yeah, it's not like your typical Greek medical word, right? It's I think it's more Indo-European in origin, with, I think, the root of lungen, which means light. And it's the lightest organ because of the air that it traps. And it turns out that even when we are instructed to breathe out as much as we can, there's still plenty of air left in our lungs.
You know, I learned that because, this is a little aside, but I'm a singer, and the breath and the lungs are really important for singing, right? And one of the things my My chorus director, he's always telling us, because when you're trying to hold a really long note, there's always more air in your lungs. You feel as if you're running out of breath, but actually there's more air there, and you can keep pushing it out. And I think it's a really interesting concept that, yes, there's always air in the lungs. But what goes wrong? I mean, not being able to breathe is like a really very, very unpleasant state for a human being to be in.
Yes, indeed. Lung disease encompasses quite a number of diseases that collectively affect the lung in a way where it doesn't function properly. It gets in the way of, as mentioned earlier, oxygenating the blood and providing that vital energy that is required for the rest of our organs. There is a spectrum that ranges all the way from diseases that are caused by a single gene and are developed from birth, such as cystic fibrosis, primary ciliary dyskinesia is one of them, all the way to diseases that are predominantly induced by environmental challenges, such as COPD, and generally develop at a later stage of life. In all cases, though, what we see from the pathophysiology of these diseases, what breaks down is the system that brings clean air down to the distal part of the lung, where you get the gas exchange with the blood. Those parts of the lungs either get obstructed, meaning something makes them narrower so the air doesn't go through it. And we know very well that inflammation plays a very important role. Remodeling of the structural component of that conductive airway plays a very important role. And the consequences of that, not getting clean, fresh air down into the distal lung, can range from not being oxygenated to oxygenate the blood to persistent inflammation that starts destroying that part of the lung. And this is probably the two ends of the spectrum that include asthma on one end and probably COPD on the other end, and emphysema that may be familiar to some of our audience, where the destruction of the distal lung really breaks down its ability to oxygenate the blood.
So, of course, oxygen is absolutely critical for every cell in our body, and it's the lung that's the conduit for the oxygen to every other cell, right?
Yes, for sure. And its, basic function is about gas exchange, right? The air goes through your lungs and had to go all the way through the conducting airways to the alveoli, where the actual gas exchange takes place at a single cell layer level. And these, once the gas exchange, you got the good oxygen, you kind of pass back the carbon dioxide, it has to go all the way back, right? And this happens over 20,000 times a day. And so if you think about it, in terms of interacting with the environment, you've got your lungs that does the air exchange, you've got your gut that, process the food you eat, and then you've got your skin that is just exposed, right? These are like three different points of exposure. With your skin, you can cover up with, clothing, protect yourself with sunscreen or whatever. With your gut, you could say, okay, I'm being very choosy about what I eat, right? But with your lungs, what choice do you have in terms of the air you breathe, right? And smoking is just one way to kind of unfortunately expose your lungs to kind of like especially polluted air. But really, 10% of COPD patients actually get damage from the other type of air pollutants, like wood stove smoke, or just highway gas and whatnot, right? And so in terms of the stigma of people who, unfortunately were addicted to cigarette smoke for years and got the damage, yes. But at the same time, we are all facing the same issue.
So often when we think about our lungs, we think about how we're experiencing them. And for example, it's quite common to suffer from a bout of bronchitis or have a nasty cough or a cold. What's going on then when we're sort of reacting to sort of other things in our environment, allergens, pathogens that are affecting our lung function?
Yeah, our lungs, they're open to the outside environment. So they get bombarded with all sorts of particles, dust, pollen, viruses. We obviously went through a pandemic very recently, and that was a respiratory virus that got into our system through the lung. And the lung is set up to fight these insults, these daily insults. It's the price that we pay for getting clean oxygen, clean air to oxygenate our blood, coming back to the same theme as before. And the lung has a number of ways of fighting those insults. The simplest of which is a system that's called the mucociliary escalator. It's actually a system that produces mucus, a sticky substance where all of these particles, all of these things that come in stick. And it's coupled with a system of specialized cells that function like brushes, and they're continuously pushing that sticky stuff up and out of your airway. So think about it like a flypaper conveyor belt that is continuously removing all of these things in a very natural way. The matter of fact is that we swallow about 2 liters of mucus every day without even realizing it.
I was waiting for you to get that in here, Daniel, somehow. Daniel loves to talk about mucus.
I had to. Mucus has been a big part of my career, and I think it has some wonderful properties that protect us from the primary defense system that's going to get things out of our system before they even get a chance to attack our actual our cells underneath. But there's a lot of things that get through. They've evolved in that way. They have mechanisms to attack that system and get through. And that's where our primary line of defense then becomes a thin layer of cells, that is the epithelium, that tries to fight them off. And if it doesn't, then it sounds the alarms and it brings in the immune system. And the immune system is basically that's when the troops come in and they actually try to kill off and remove all of these the pollutants and the invaders that come in with the air. That happens continuously throughout our life. And most of the time, we don't even realize it. We only realize it when this doesn't work properly and the intruders get through, they get into our system, and then we need to spike a fever, really bring the big guns in. And unfortunately, this requires a lot of energy. So this is the feeling of feeling sick, is that us feeling our body fighting off all of these intruders and the infections. We'll feel this for 2 or 3 days and then we'll get over it and then move on with our lives. Unfortunately, for patients that suffer from respiratory diseases, this lasts much longer. And usually every time that this happens, their disease is going to get worse and it's going to progress. And this is a primary focus of when we try to develop therapeutic approaches, but also novel medicines. These are the processes that we're trying to either dampen down or reduce so that they can fight off these invaders without progressing their disease.
Hi, Maria.
Hi, Wellington.
And look who we have back.
Hello, Maria.
Hey, Stephanie, good to see you.
Karen's still in Italy, so I thought I'd stop by the bar.
Wonderful.
Maria, I thought it was a really interesting point that the lung is actually exposed to the air that surrounds us. We always think of it as an internal organ, but it's actually very vulnerable. And so, can you talk more about the ways that the pollutants in the air actually damage the lungs and then lead to the diseases like COPD or asthma?
I can try. So our lungs, as you point out, they have evolved to be exposed to the external air, but there's kind of probably a limit to, what they can tolerate. And so within the lung, there are sort of alarm signals that will go off when irritants are exposed in there. Various different biological pathways are involved. The immune system, you may have heard of a protein called the inflammasome, which can get triggered by non-infectious agents such as smoke and wood smoke and things like that. But essentially, it's a reaction that the body has to things that are perceived as dangerous, and then it can overcorrect, and that's what leads to some of these diseases.
So, Maria, you knew I was going to ask this question. 2 liters of mucus? What? How? Why?
I know, it's kind of terrifying to think about it, isn't it? But of course, it's not all being produced at once. It's over the course of the day. Your lungs are generating this mucus, which they need. goes up the mucociliary elevator. I'm wiggling my fingers to illustrate it right now, but it's like a little moving carpet of little cilia that are moving this mucus up through your lungs just to constantly pull things that you've inhaled out of your lungs. And I know you have asthma, for example, Wellington, so you probably take an inhaled medicine sometimes. Now, most of that gets inhaled and then gets absorbed into the lung where it works, but not all of it will. And so then that any leftover sort of medicine gets pulled up through the mucociliary elevator and swallowed. So that's one example of how mucus interacts with things that go into our lungs. Dorothy, can you tell us a little bit more about how our lungs normally respond to pathogens and infections and how that goes wrong when you have an underlying lung condition?
I think you guys did address this in season 4 in the Taking a Deep Breath episode, is this maladaptive response, right? As Daniel was describing, our body, when we bring in the big guns to fight off infections, there are these, we increase our mucus secretion and the inflammatory cells that come in and fight off the invaders, but at the same time, there is a little bit of collateral damage. But in maladaptive responses, like these things just kind of take over, as the leading player. And the exacerbations is the term we use for people with underlying asthma or COPD or whatnot. When they get an infection, their body's already got, too much inflammation to begin with. And when they get an episode, then, that increase of inflammation is just that much more significant. That's why it takes a while for them to kind of get back to their normal status. I don't have asthma, but even those of us who may not have underlying pulmonary conditions, we can get a viral infection and get a cough for a good 3-4 weeks afterwards. It's part of the same spectrum. Yeah.
And that's just the inflammatory response that still hasn't died down. That's why you're still coughing.
That's correct.
3 or 4 weeks after.
Yeah, and cough, right? Cough is very our physiologic response to actually this forced expelling of bad stuff.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Yeah, when we were talking about some of the pathologies of these diseases, I wondered if you could dig a little bit deeper. What's emphysema and what's bronchitis, and how do those two things interplay with each other to make people sick?
Yeah, so COPD, when traditionally taught, there are two kind of opposite end, but it's really the same syndrome of people who, after years of damage, say from smoking, and then they have a similar picture of having a hard time breathing air, right? That's why the obstructive component. But there is actually two opposite end of the spectrum. One is a more chronic bronchitis picture, where these are patients that have airways that had that exaggerated response that Daniel described with the mucus cells. And when you have too much mucus and then also inflammation of those airways, it actually causes a breakdown of the mucociliary elevator. And this inflammation and overproduction of mucus then over time narrows your airway. And that's what's causing the obstruction. So that's the chronic bronchitis side of things. Moving to the other side, it's the emphysema, where you get down to the level of the alveoli, where it's just one type 1 pneumocyte with your blood vessel, and you actually.
What's a pneumocyte?
So we call the lung like a forest, right? So you have your trachea, which your main windpipe, and then it branches off into keep dividing and branches off into smaller and smaller airways. When you get to the very end is this alveolus, and it's composed of a type 1 pneumocyte and a type 2 pneumocyte. It's basically one cell at that final kind of stop. And that is that single cell level where you get the air exchange. And what happened is with damage, from the environment, some sort of toxin, you could actually kill the cell because it's just one lonely pneumocyte at the end. And in emphysema, you have destruction at that level. And the type 2 pneumocyte, you can't have type 1 without type 2. The type 2 pneumocyte is also at the alveoli level, and it has a ability to regenerate. However, if the damage is continuous, at some point we reach a capacity and the damage is just permanent. We can't repair it any further. And so when the alveoli are intact, it has this recoil. That's how we breathe out. When we exhale, it's a very passive process. The air just gets pushed out of our lungs. But when you have this kind of damage at the alveoli level, it's like a balloon that has a hole in it. So there is no more recoil, and the air just kind of leaks out and just kind of stay there. And so that's why it's hard for these patients to breathe out. And so the same phenomenon of obstruction is observed, but it's a very, very different mechanism. But in actuality, it's a spectrum. Most patients have both bronchitis and emphysema component. Yeah.
That's interesting. It sounds as if the emphysema component, when you're talking about cells that have actually been destroyed, is particularly challenging from a making medicines to treat disease perspective.
Absolutely. You're absolutely right, Maria. What we see in the lungs of patients with COPD is that these very delicate structures are destroyed. And normally there are processes for cells to repair and recover these structures because our lungs are continuously being damaged and repaired. But these mechanisms go awry in these tissues. So what we're very interested in doing is, on the one hand, stopping those insults that push the destruction of this part of the lung, because we first need to stop those forces. But once we've stopped those forces, the only way to gain back that functionality is to regenerate. Obviously, this is easier said than done. The pathways that we need to modulate with potential new novel medicines are quite delicate and very difficult to fine-tune so that we're actually doing good instead of harm. Because if we overdo it, that can go down a negative path. Nevertheless, this is exactly as where in respiratory diseases, the field has made great advances in stopping those destructive mechanisms. Now we're slowly starting to look into the future and think, once we've achieved that, how do we help patients regain that functionality of the lung, looking at regenerating and taking advantage of cells, either of cells that are present there, that we can energize them and we can coax them into going above and beyond and regenerating in a difficult condition, or potentially also bringing in cells from external sources that can help populate those damaged areas and contribute to regenerating the distal lung.
I remember hearing that actually your lungs could be quite damaged before you really feel it functionally. Tell us a bit more about that.
Yes, the lungs are amazing in having reserve, right? As I mentioned, we breathe so many times a day. Our lungs are constantly working. So there is this enormous kind of like backup, if you will. And so when we say classify the severity of asthma or COPD, we look at, lung function by, it's actually very basic that we measure how much volume of air people can move and how fast they can move it. And that's how we measure things, and we label things like obstruction is by these lung volume measurements, or how much air is left in your lung, for example, that we just talked about, right? When we classify the severity, we say, you are about, this percentage of normal. Normal being, when we have kind of at a population level, look at how much lung volume people should have, right? We're talking about 80 to 100% is actually normal. So you could lose, or mild to normal. And so you could lose actually quite a bit before you even feel it. And there are people, I should say, that have lung functions above normal. and they wouldn't know it, but they have more reserve, so they're gonna actually be able to lose a lot more before they feel anything, and that is a challenge. Actually, it's both a curse and a blessing, in the sense that it's great that we have this reserve, but then there's a curse that when we do show up with symptoms, the disease process is well on its way. So.
I remember seeing, I think, at a respiratory conference, that this association between respiratory capacity in childhood and incidence of disease later in life, which I thought was really interesting. So this is going on to your point that some people, just through genetics or luck or whatever, there's a fairly wide variation in lung capacity in people to start with, but you don't know that, right? You can't tell by looking at somebody, oh yeah, you've got lower lung capacity, you need to be careful, don't smoke, right? That type of thing.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And that's something that I think, for those of us who are in the field, we feel like, well, what if, there is a more kind of accepted notion that we ought to actually check for these things earlier on,
Yeah, early detection is always so important. And I think when we think now about large patient data sets and using AI to predict outcomes, perhaps there's some more useful things we can learn about people in general and their risk of lung diseases.
That's right.
Maria, what is the difference between COPD and emphysema, or are they similar?
Oh, so emphysema is a sort of sub-pathology of COPD. COPD is the overall chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, is the overall name for the disorder. And some people with COPD have it manifesting as emphysema, which is when the lung has been destroyed. So there's bigger holes essentially in the lung. And then the other side of COPD is bronchitis, where the lung is still intact, but there's just a lot of blockage with mucus. So people can have both bronchitis and emphysema, or they could have one or the other, but they still have COPD. So Daniel, you talked a little bit about theories of regeneration and repair. What else is going on in the world of lung function improvements? Where do we see the future treatments for people with these diseases?
I take a little bit of a step back and make an acknowledgement of some amazing advances that have happened in the cystic fibrosis field. Because when it comes to lung function, that is probably an example where a monogenic disease with a very clear reason for development, which is directly linked to what we were talking about earlier, the mucociliary clearance, that mucociliary escalator breaking down and not functioning properly. Work in developing therapeutics that directly targeted the heart of that, what drives that disease, made an enormous difference for those patients, to the point where what I've been told by clinicians is some of the early patients, the types of patients that they used to see has completely changed because of these new therapies. Their lungs are more resilient, they respond better to the challenges, they have less issues with lung functions. And the functionality of the lung is clearly improved. So I think we have a very good example from that respiratory disease that targeting that function of the airway is a very important step to improve lung function. And some of these pathologies that are seen in cystic fibrosis also translate to other diseases as well. When it comes to COPD, it's probably the disease where we have the least understanding of what is at the heart of that disease, what we should be targeting. There have been recent advances that target the immune system, the persistent inflammation, the maladaptive inflammation. Unfortunately, that is targeted to a rather small segment of the patient population. So there is still quite a lot of work to do for the patients that are not addressed with that, so that we can stop the loss of lung function before we start the hard work of trying to regain that lung function in those patients. We've learned a lot over the years. We know that the first line of defense, that airway epithelium, when it sounds the alarms, when it does that inappropriately, that brings in too much inflammation, and this is where targeting what is called those epithelial alarmins, which is kind of the cell biology way of saying alarms that bring in the immune system, inhibiting over activation of those has provided quite a bit of benefit. But we have a lot of work to do on that still.
What do you think, Dorothy?
I think where we, really the dream, right, is what you and I just talked about earlier detection. These trajectories of, if your kind of peak lung capacity is at this point and is actually lower, then what are some of the ways that this person should, take better care of this, themselves, right? And, with that, combination of earlier prediction, if you will, of the trajectory actually determine the best course of treatment. Because as Daniel mentioned, COPD in and of itself, the hardest part is how heterogeneous this disease is. And so the better we can define, what are we treating, then the better we can target each of the needs of these kind of different phenotype within the COPD broad disease itself.
Do you see us maybe segmenting these unmet needs out even more and really identifying different patient subsets that need different types of treatments?
Exactly. I think that's, the key to success there. And I think with this era of machine learning, I'm really hopeful that it would actually boost that effort.
Imaging is a very important aspect of understanding lung function. That's really come a long way, right? Any comments on that?
That's right. As I mentioned earlier, the basic kind of definition of some of these obstructive diseases come from measurement of lung volume, which if you think about it is kind of like a summary statement. How much do you breathe in versus breathe out? And it's like the summation of the whole lung. But imaging offers us a chance to actually look at different regions of the lung. Is it the airway? Is it at the level of the lung tissue and the alveoli? And or is it the upper part of the lung? We have several different lobes of lungs. And that's why it's lungs, not just one lung.
And you can live without a whole lung, can't you?
Exactly.
I have a friend who had lung cancer, and fortunately, removing one lobe of her lung, one lung was sufficient to cure the disease.
Yeah, and in fact, in emphysema, there are patients that have localized emphysema, and one of the treatment is actually just to block the air from getting to that part of the kind of unusable lung, if you will, and it is actually a valid treatment.
Any cool techniques or tools in the field?
One interesting tool that we have is Xenon MRI, which allows us essentially to visualize the air as it's entering the lung. And not only its path from your mouth, essentially, all the way down to your distal lung, but also as it diffuses within that the deep tissue of the lung. And that really allows us to understand how your lung is functioning. Where the air is going, how it's diffusing and getting into your blood.
And the xenon journey, if you will, that is measured by this technique, then you can actually time it. How long does it take for it to travel from the balloon that these patients get to breathe in, all the way to the level of the red blood cell? And this is actually a more advanced version of another measure that we use called the DLCO, the diffusing capacity of carbon monoxide, because carbon monoxide is another gas that definitely can travel and diffuse into the red blood cell. But again, that DLCO, abbreviated version of diffusing capacity of carbon monoxide, is measured as part of lung function. And it's, again, a summary measurement, as opposed to the xenon MRI, if we kind of can measure a longer time it takes for that diffusion. At a localized level, we would know exactly where that pathology is in the lung. And that's the interesting part or fascinating part.
It is
about that
fascinating because one of the hard things about developing drugs in these indications is you need large studies, long outcomes, right? You're looking for prevention of progression of disease. So you've got to study people for what, a couple of years, a year or two, usually to understand it. But then I like the way these types of imaging techniques can perhaps help you in just a small number of patients get some idea of what your drugs might be doing before you invest in an enormous clinical trial. I know that we've been trying hard to find ways to answer sort of the more scientific questions in patients before we invest in bigger studies. And that was, to me, I find that really interesting. Are there any other interesting techniques that we're thinking about for translating things from the science into the patient space?
Yes, there is this other imaging technique called the mucociliary clearance test. That's where we can use a imaging technique to actually watch the progress of this mucociliary elevator. And so if we have an intervention that is supposed to improve that, we could actually measure the speed of the mucus being moved up.
That is super cool. And the other thing I think is really interesting is that older imaging techniques like X-rays and CTs and static images of the lungs can now give us a lot more information because of AI/ML types of algorithms looking for specific patterns within lung tissue that we may not have been able to correlate before with clinical endpoints. So I'd like to close this wonderful conversation by sort of asking you both where you see the future for improvement in patients' lives with lung diseases. Is it in the better prediction, better understanding of where diseases are going, or is it in the treatments, or is it both?
I'm going to take the easy way out and say both, because there's a couple of things that I think I'm quite optimistic about. And one is, given all of the effort that is going into analyzing what is happening in patients' lungs, I think we're going to get a better understanding of what is driving their disease. And inevitably, this is going to help us develop better therapeutics on the one hand, and then on the other hand, this is maybe a hope rather than a prediction of what's going to happen in the future, but we are going to be looking more and more into regenerative approaches so that we can actually not just stop the progression of diseases, but bring back functionality of the lung, really to give quality of life back to patients.
I'm going to even take the easier way out, which is ditto. We need both. We really need improvement for both to work together, better diagnosis, better treatment, and vice versa.
I'm now going to have a new awareness of what I am breathing in and how much mucus I am swallowing on a daily basis, thanks to this conversation. So thank you both very much for joining me. It's been a wonderful conversation.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for having me, Maria. It's been a wonderful conversation.
That was a great episode. Where are we, do you think, with all of these learnings? There's a huge amount of unmet need, for example, in COPD. Do you think that we're going to see things in our lifetime to help this population?
I do. I think we're understanding a lot more about the specific immunological pathways that are relevant in COPD. With the advent of bigger genetic data sets and more information from patient samples and a better understanding of the single cellular biology of the lung, I'm pretty confident that we will see breakthroughs in COPD treatment in the relatively near future.
That's super promising for some of the genetic aspects of lung disease, but what can we do about environmental aspects? We talked a lot in this episode about the lung being exposed to the air we breathe, and we don't always have a choice about that.
So actually, what we are learning is that the disease is a combination of an individual's genetics and the environment in which they live. So hopefully we will be able to tailor treatments to lung diseases that are caused by different insults, for example. So I think it's both genetics and environment are very important for lung diseases. And untangling how genetics and environment interact in disease pathology should help us develop better therapies. And that's our show. Thanks so much for listening. If you haven't already, rate our podcast wherever you listen. It will help new people to find us. And be sure to subscribe. If you have a question about the show, you can contact us at podcast@gene.com. That's GENE.com. And now for me, it's back to wrestling with data.